The morning Georgia Slater rode out to her father's land with a deed in one hand and a rifle across her saddle. She had no idea that the most infuriating, complicated, and ultimately necessary man she would ever meet was already standing on her front porch waiting for her. The year was 1874, and the territory of Wyoming was still raw and unfinished, a place where the sky seemed too large for the earth beneath it, where the wind carried the smell of pine and dust and something wilder than either. The Slater homestead sat on 80 acres of mixed grassland and timber at the foot of the Laramie Mountains, and it had belonged to George's father, Edmund Slater, for the better part of 20 years. Edmund had been a stubborn, quiet man who believed that land was the one honest thing left in the world. He had cleared the property, built the house with his own 2 hands, run cattle on the southern pasture, and cut timber from the northern ridge every winter without fail. Then, 3 weeks before Georgia arrived, he had sat down in his chair by the fire and simply stopped being alive. The doctor in Laramie said it was his heart. Georgia believed it was exhaustion. Either way, he was gone. The will was simple, as Edmund himself had been. The land went to Georgia, but Edmund had owed a debt to a land speculator named Harlan Croft, and Croft had moved quickly, filing a contested claim at the county office before Georgia had even been notified of her father's death. The ruling handed down by the land office judge was this: Georgia Slater would be given 1 full season spring planting through fall harvest to demonstrate productive use and legal occupancy of the land. If she could show at the end of that period that the land had been actively worked and maintained, the claim would be settled in her favor. If she could not, Harlan Croft would have the legal right to purchase the debt and absorb the property into his growing land holdings north of town. Georgia had received the letter on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, she was on a horse heading northwest out of Cheyenne, where she had been working as a seamstress for the past 3 years. She was 26 years old, had not worked a piece of land since she was a girl helping her father, and had exactly $42 to her name, a small trunk of clothing, and the deed her father had mailed her 2 years prior as a precaution. She was not afraid. She told herself she was not afraid. She repeated it twice more as the mountains came into view. The homestead was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she had simply grown. The house was a solid 2-room structure of hewn timber and stone, with a covered porch that faced east and caught the morning light. The barn stood about 50 yards behind it, still in good repair. The pasture fence needed work. The garden plot her mother had once kept on the south side of the house was overgrown with tall grass and scrub, but the soil beneath would be good. Georgia could see that much. She pulled her horse to a stop at the fence line and looked at the whole of it, trying to feel something that was not grief or anger. That was when she noticed the man. He was leaning against one of the porch posts with his arms folded across his chest and his hat pushed back on his head, watching her approach with the patient expression of someone who had been there long enough to get comfortable. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a few days of beard on his jaw. He wore a plain canvas work coat over a cotton shirt, trousers that had seen honest labor, and boots that told the same story. He had a rifle propped beside him against the wall, not pointed at anything threatening, just present. He looked to be close to 30, maybe a year or 2 either side of it. Georgia rode right up to the porch steps and stopped. "This is private property," she said. "It is," the man agreed. He did not seem alarmed by her tone or by the rifle resting across her saddle. "Then I would like to know what you are doing on it." He unfolded his arms and straightened up from the post. "Name is Frederick Hale. I was hired on as a farmhand here by your father about 8 months ago. I was in Cheyenne picking up supplies when he passed. Came back to find him gone and the place empty." He paused. "I was not sure what was going to happen with the property. I stayed on to look after it." Georgia studied him for a long moment. He met her gaze without flinching, which she noted. Men in her experience either looked away too quickly or stared too hard. This man simply looked, as though he was doing the same thing she was taking measure. "My father never mentioned a farmhand in his letters," she said. He was not a man who wrote much about people, Frederick said. He wrote about weather and cattle prices. That was accurate enough that Georgia felt a strange twist of recognition in her chest. She dismounted and tied her horse to the porch rail. "I am Georgia Slater," she said. "Edmund's daughter. I know, he talked about you." She did not ask what he had said. She was not ready for that yet. She walked up the steps and looked at him squarely. "The land is mine. I have the deed and the ruling from the county office. I have 1 season to prove it, and I intend to do exactly that." Frederick nodded slowly. "I heard about the Croft claim. Word travels fast in Laramie. Then you understand the situation." "I do." He picked up his hat and turned it once in his hands. "Miss Slater, I have nowhere pressing to be. I know this land. I know how your father worked it, what the soil needs, what the cattle need, where the fence is weak and where the water runs dry in late summer. I would like to stay on and help you through the season." Georgia stared at him. "Why?" The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, not because it was rude, but because it was direct in a way he had not anticipated. He considered it honestly. "Because your father was a decent man who treated me fairly," he said. "Because what Harlan Croft is doing is not right. And because I have the feeling you are going to work yourself to death trying to do this alone, and that would be a waste. That is a very frank assessment of my capabilities." "It is an assessment of the situation," he said, "not your capabilities. The situation is not fair and it is not easy. That has nothing to do with you." Georgia looked out across the pasture for a moment, then back at him. "I will not be paying wages I do not have. Room and board is enough for now." She almost said no. She had been practicing independence for 3 years in Cheyenne, had gotten very good at it, and the idea of accepting help, particularly from a stranger who was already standing on her land when she arrived, sat uncomfortably in her. But she was also looking at 80 acres and a season's worth of work that had to be done, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize the math. "There is a room off the back of the barn," she said. "My father used it for storage, but it is dry and the stove works. You can have it." "That is more than enough," Frederick said. "And I make the decisions about the land," she added. "You advise, I decide." He nodded. "Agreed." "Then get my horse settled. I need to see what state the house is in." She walked inside before he could respond, and if there was a small, complicated feeling in her chest that was part relief and part something else entirely, she did her best to ignore it. There was too much work to do for feelings. The house was cold but clean. Frederick had been keeping it that way, she could tell, sweeping the floors, airing the rooms. Her father's things were still where he had left them, his Bible on the shelf, his pipe on the mantel, his coat on the hook by the door. Georgia stood in the main room for a long time with her hand against the doorframe, and she let herself grieve quietly for exactly 5 minutes. Then she went to find where her father had kept his tools. The first week was pure relentless labor. Georgia rose before the sun and did not stop until dark drove her inside. She had memories of farm work from her childhood, but memory and muscle were different things, and the first 3 days left her so sore she had to will each step. She said nothing about it. She planted the kitchen garden with seeds she had bought in Cheyenne: beans, squash, corn, a row of late tomatoes. She repaired the chicken coop and bought 6 laying hens from a neighboring homestead a mile east. She took stock of the cattle, 7 head, all in reasonable condition, and got acquainted with each of them in the slow, practical way her father had taught her. Frederick worked alongside her without making her feel watched. That was the thing she noticed first. He did not hover or offer commentary she had not asked for. He appeared where the work was, did it efficiently, and moved on to the next thing. He repaired the east fence while she tended the garden. He hauled water from the creek while she patched the barn roof. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it, which was its own kind of communication. On the 4th morning, Georgia was struggling with a fence post that had rotted at the base and needed to be driven in at an awkward angle against a rocky patch of ground. She had been at it for 20 minutes and was making no progress. She heard boots behind her. "You have to angle it about 15 degrees west," Frederick said, crouching beside the hole. There is a flat stone under there that is going to deflect the post if you drive it straight. How do you know that? Because I put that fence in 6 months ago and I remember where I hit the stone. He looked at her sideways. Do you want help or do you want to hammer it for another half hour? Georgia handed him the post driver with a look that was not quite gracious. He set the post, adjusted the angle and drove it in with 4 clean strokes. She watched his back and shoulders as he worked and noted clinically that he was very strong. She took the information the way she would take information about the weather useful, noted, filed away. Thank you, she said. Your father would have remembered about the stone, Frederick said, straightening up. He had every inch of this land in his head. He did, Georgia agreed. She was quiet for a moment. What was he like at the end? His letters were cheerful, but I always wondered if he was telling me the truth. Frederick looked out at the pasture. He was tired. He would not admit it, but the work was harder for him than it had been. He was proud, though, still proud. He looked back at her. He talked about you coming back someday. He hoped you would. Georgia felt the tightening in her throat that meant tears were close, and she breathed through it steadily. I should have come sooner. You did not know, Frederick said simply. He said it without pity, which was the only way she could have received it. She picked up the tools and moved on to the next post. By the end of the first week, a routine had formed that felt almost domestic, though neither of them would have called it that. Georgia cooked in the mornings, enough for both of them, and left Frederick's portion on the porch since he rose even earlier than she did. He left wood cut and stacked by the door without being asked. In the evenings, when the light was too far gone for outdoor work, Georgia sat at the table and kept her accounts, recording everything she spent, everything the land produced, every improvement she made. Because the land office judge had told her that written documentation of productive use would be important when settlement day came. Frederick sat outside on the porch steps after supper with a cup of coffee and looked at the mountains, which was the closest he seemed to get to rest. Once, in that second week, she came outside to check the weather and found him sitting there in the last gray light of the evening. She stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, and the mountains were turning purple in the distance and the first stars were appearing, and the whole scene had a quality of peace that was almost violent in its beauty after the sharpness of the day's work. She sat down on the step beside him without quite meaning to. "Do you have family?" she asked. He looked at his coffee. "A brother in Colorado." "Parents gone, you?" "An aunt in Missouri. We are not close." She pulled her shawl tighter. "Do you miss having somewhere to be?" "I am somewhere," he said. She looked at him then, not with the assessing look from the first day, but with something quieter. He was looking at the mountains, and his profile against the dark sky was thoughtful and still. She found, to her mild surprise, that she did not want to go back inside. "Why did you come to Wyoming?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I was working a cattle drive out of Texas," he said finally. 3 years ago, came through the territory and liked it, the scale of it, the way there is room to think." He turned his head and looked at her. "Some places press in on you. This place opens up." "It does," she agreed softly. They sat for a little while longer in the opening dark, not quite talking, not quite silent, and the mountain stood at the edge of everything, patient and enormous, and Georgia thought that whatever the next 4 months held, at least the land itself was not changed. At least that part was still her father's. Harlan Croft came in the 3rd week. He rode up with 2 men Georgia did not know, men who had the particular look of hired weight, large, quiet, watching. Croft himself was a florid man in his late 40s with a good suit coat that was slightly too small across the middle and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He tipped his hat to Georgia as though they were old acquaintances at a social. "Miss Slater," he said, "it is good to finally meet you. I am sorry for your loss. Edmund was a man I respected greatly." "He owed you money," Georgia said. "That is a different thing than being respected." Croft's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Debts between businessmen are a sign of trust, not enmity. I simply want what I am owed. You understand." "I understand the situation perfectly," Georgia said. She was standing on the porch with her arms at her sides, and she did not step down to meet him, and she did not invite him up. The land office has given me a season to demonstrate occupancy and productive use. I intend to do that. I would appreciate it if you would save your next visit for settlement day. I am simply checking in, Croft said pleasantly. His eyes moved past her to the house, across to the barn, calculating pricing. A woman alone out here, it is a concern for the community. I am not alone, Georgia said. Frederick appeared from the barn doorway at that moment, coincidental in timing or not, carrying a fence rail across his shoulders. He set it down and looked at the riders without expression. Croft looked at him for a moment. "Hale," he said, with a flatness that suggested they had met before and the meeting had not been pleasant. "Croft," Frederick said. The silence between them had a specific texture that Georgia catalogued and saved for later. Croft turned back to Georgia and spread his hands in a gesture of magnanimity. "Well, I hope the season goes well for you, Miss Slater. The land office will be very thorough in their review." "I expect they will be," Georgia said. "Good day, Mr. Croft." She held his gaze until he turned his horse, and she stood on the porch until the 3 riders had cleared the property. Then she let out a long, slow breath through her nose. Frederick walked up to the porch. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly fine," she said. "What is your history with that man?" He leaned against the post, the same one he had been leaning on the morning she arrived, she noticed. "Last fall he tried to run a homesteader family off a piece of land 2 miles north of here. Manufactured a debt claim similar to what he is doing with you. I testified for the family at the land office. He did not appreciate it." He looked at her. "He knows who I am, and he knows I will testify again if it comes to that. Will it come to that? Depends on whether the work you are doing speaks for itself." "Then we had better make sure it does," Georgia said. They went back to work. April turned the land from brown to a tentative, fragile green, and Georgia began to understand what her father had loved so specifically about this place. The mornings were cold and crystalline, and the afternoons were warm with a wind that smelled of the mountains. The garden came up in neat, determined rows. The cattle were fat with spring grass. She bought 2 more hens and a rooster from the neighbor who had sold her the first 6. A widower named Augustin Reyes, who had been working his land since 1866, and who came by once a week to check on things with the transparent excuse of returning borrowed tools. "You are making progress," Augustin told her one afternoon, looking out at the garden and the newly repaired fence line. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with a kind face and careful eyes. "Edmund would be glad." "I hope so," Georgia said. Augustin looked toward the barn where Frederick was visible through the open door, working on a wheel for the wagon. "Hale is a good worker. Edmund trusted him." "I have noticed," Georgia said carefully. Augustin smiled at something in the distance. "He built half that fence in October," he said. "Did not have to. Edmund did not ask him to. He just saw it needed doing." Georgia looked toward the barn for a moment, then back at Augustin. "He is useful," she said, and then felt immediately that the word was insufficient and somewhat unkind, though she was not quite ready to name why. Augustin laughed softly. "Yes," he said, "I expect he is." The middle weeks of May brought rain, which was both blessing and inconvenience. The garden soaked it up eagerly. The creek ran high. The pasture turned a deep, saturated green that was almost painful to look at. The mud was everywhere and unforgiving, pulling at boots and bogging down the wagon on the days when it needed to go to town. On one of those wet evenings, with rain hammering the roof and a fire going in the hearth, Georgia was copying the week's records into her ledger, and Frederick was sitting across the table from her, repairing a leather harness by lamplight. They had been in the same room for 2 hours in companionable silence, which had stopped being strange around week 3 and had simply become ordinary. "You keep very precise records," he said, not looking up from the harness. "The land office judge told me documentation was essential." "It is." He turned the harness over. "But you would keep precise records even if he had not said so. Your father was the same way. Everything written down, every acre measured." "I grew up watching him do it," she said. "Land is not real unless you can account for it. That is what he used to say." He said it often, Frederick agreed. Georgia looked at the ledger and then at him. How long did you work for him before he died? 8 months, as I said, though I had met him a few times before that in town. He was a man people remembered. He set the harness down and looked at her across the table. In the lamplight his face was easier than it was in daylight, softer at the edges. He spoke very highly of you. He said you had his stubbornness and your mother's grace. Georgia felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the fire. He said that, more than once. Frederick picked up the harness again. He worried you were too far away to be safe. He worried about a lot of things for you. He never wrote that. No, he was the kind of man who worried in private. Georgia looked down at her ledger and the numbers blurred slightly. She pressed the tip of her pen to the paper and breathed. I am going to keep this land, she said, not quite to him, more to the room, to the house itself. I know, Frederick said. His voice was simple and certain, and it settled something in her that had been vibrating with uncertainty since the day she arrived. May opened into June, and the work intensified in the way of growing seasons, the way that living things make relentless demands on the people responsible for them. Georgia was up at 4 every morning, asleep by 9 every night, and in between she worked with a focus that was almost meditative. She learned the specific voice of every one of her cattle and could tell by the sound alone if one was distressed. She knew which section of the garden drained poorly and adjusted her watering accordingly. She knew the sound of the well rope when it needed greasing, and the sound of the barn door when the wind was about to change. She also, she noticed, knew the sound of Frederick's boots on the porch steps and could distinguish them from every other sound the property made. She noticed when he was nearby and when he was not, and the knot was increasingly unsettling in a way she examined and set aside and examined again. He made her laugh, which she had not expected. Not often and not loudly, but with a dry, precise humor that snuck up on her. On the day she spent 3 full hours trying to shoe a horse that did not want to be shod and finally stood up covered in dust and hay with her hair half out of its pins and a look of pure exhausted fury. Frederick had walked over, examined the horse calmly, fed it a handful of oats from his pocket, and then held the hoof with perfect cooperation while she drove the nail. You bribed my horse, she said flatly. I negotiated, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that made her lips curve against her will. There was also the morning she had gone to the creek before sunrise to fetch water and found him already there, washing, shirt off, his back to her. She had stopped very still and then backed away as quietly as she could and been mildly annoyed with herself for the fact that she needed a moment to compose herself before going back to the house. He was just a man. There were men everywhere. She had seen men work without their shirts before. The West was full of them. None of this was particularly relevant to the land or the season or any of the important things. She told herself this twice and got back to work. It was Frederick who noticed the creek. In mid-June, he came to find her in the garden early on a Thursday morning, with a look on his face that she had learned to read as serious. Not alarmed, he was not the kind of man who alarmed easily, but serious in the way of something that needed addressing. The creek is running lower than it should be, he said. Georgia stood and brushed soil from her gloves. How much lower? About a third. For this time of year in a normal spring it should still be nearly full. He looked north. I want to ride up to the head of it and see what is happening. I will come with you, she said. They rode north together along the creek line, picking their way through the timber on the ridge. Georgia had not been this far north on the property since she arrived, and the land up here was different from the pasture, older feeling, heavier with timber, the light coming through the canopy in broken slabs. The creek wound through it with a sound that changed as they rode. She began to hear it even before she saw it, the sound of water being interrupted. The creek had been diverted, not naturally. Someone had built a small earthwork dam about 100 yards above the northern property line, cutting across a natural bend in the water and redirecting a significant portion of the flow to the east, which was toward Harlan Croft's land. Georgia sat on her horse and looked at it for a long moment in silence, When, she said. Within the last week, Frederick said, reading the disturbed earth. The mud is still fresh on the edges of the work. He cannot do this, Georgia said. This creek is on my land. It is marked in the deed. The dam is above your property line, Frederick said, measuring the distance with his eye, by about 30 feet, which means it is on public land, which means he is within his legal rights to make use of it. He paused, technically. Georgia looked at the dam and felt the particular cold fury that came not from surprise but from recognition, the recognition of a man who was smart enough to do damage carefully. He is going to dry out my pasture by August if I do not have enough water. He is counting on it. She turned her horse. We need to dig an alternative channel. If we can route the remaining flow more efficiently through the pasture, it will compensate for most of the loss. Frederick was already looking at the terrain, calculating. It will take 2 weeks of heavy work. We will need Augustin to help. I will ask him tomorrow, Georgia said. The ride back to the homestead was quiet. The trees gave way to open ground and the mountains were enormous and blue in the midday distance. And Georgia's jaw was set and her back was straight, and she was thinking about drainage and channels and soil composition, which was how she handled things that made her furious. She processed them into work. Frederick rode beside her, not speaking, respecting the silence. After a while she glanced at him sideways. He is trying to make the land unproductive, she said. If the pasture dries out and the cattle suffer, the land office will say I have not demonstrated adequate use of the land. Yes, Frederick said. He planned this from the beginning. The debt claim, the timeline, and now this. Most likely. And there is nothing technically illegal about it. Not the dam, Frederick said, but I would like to look at the original debt documents if you have them. She looked at him. What for? Because men like Croft sometimes make mistakes in their paperwork, he said, or they manufacture documents in ways that are not quite legal, and if there is a flaw in the debt claim itself, then none of the rest of it matters. Georgia turned this over. Do you know anything about legal documents? Enough, he said. I spent 2 years reading law before I decided I liked the land better. She stared at him. You read law? For 2 years, he said, not quite defensively. You might have mentioned this, Georgia said. You never asked what I did before Wyoming, he said. There was the ghost of the corner of the mouth thing again. Get the documents out tonight, she said, facing forward again. We will look at them together. That evening, they spread Harlan Croft's debt claim and all of Edmund Slater's related papers across the kitchen table, and went through them by lamplight with the careful attention of people who were looking for something specific and were not certain what it was. Georgia read with sharp focus. Frederick read slowly and thoroughly, going back over passages more than once. It was past 10 when Frederick put his finger on a line in the debt agreement and said, Here. Georgia leaned in. The lamplight caught the side of her face, and Frederick kept his attention on the document with deliberate discipline. The repayment clause, she said, reading. The debt was to be repaid upon Edmund's death or the transfer of the property, not before, Frederick said. But Croft filed the contested claim 4 days before Edmund died. Technically, the debt was not yet callable at the time he filed. Georgia read it again, and again. That would mean the claim was premature. At minimum, it was irregular. Depending on how the county judge reads the terms, it could invalidate the entire claim. He sat back. It is not certain, but it is an argument. Georgia looked up from the paper. He was close. They had both been leaning over the table, and for a moment the kitchen felt very small and warm. She did not move back. Can you write this up in a form the land office would accept, she said. I can. Then we write it tomorrow, she said, after the water channel work. He nodded and began gathering the papers carefully. Their hands overlapped briefly on the same stack of documents, and neither of them moved immediately. The lamp flickered. Georgia became very aware of the sound of the rain starting again on the roof. Georgia, he said, and it was the first time he had used her name and not her surname, and the way he said it was quiet and different from every other time anyone had ever said it, as though it belonged to a different language entirely. She looked at him. I want you to know, he said, and then stopped as if weighing something. I want you to know that whatever happens with the claim, this land should be yours. Your father knew it and I know it, and I am going to do everything I can to make sure it is settled that way." She held his gaze for a moment that stretched longer than moments usually did. "I know," she said, and then more quietly, "Thank you, Frederick." He nodded and went out to the barn, and Georgia sat at the table for a few minutes longer and listened to the rain, and tried to understand the feeling in her chest, which was not entirely related to land claims. Augustine came the next day, and the three of them spent the better part of a week cutting a secondary channel from the creek's reduced flow down through a natural depression in the pasture's north edge. It was brutal, sweating work in the summer heat, digging through root-crossed soil, hauling rock for the channel sides. Augustine worked with the economical efficiency of a man who had done every kind of farm labor imaginable, and he and Frederick developed a quiet working shorthand that made the labor faster. Georgia worked beside both of them, ignoring the suggestions from Augustine that she take breaks she did not need. On the third evening of the channel work, sitting under the big pine at the edge of the pasture with their water canteens, Augustine looked at Frederick and then at Georgia and then back at the mountains with a serene expression. "Good land," he said, "worth fighting for." "It is," Georgia agreed. "Edmund always said his daughter would know what to do with it," Augustine said. He was right. He drank from his canteen. He also said she would be too stubborn to accept help gracefully, but that the right kind of help would find her anyway. Georgia looked at him sideways. "He said that. He was a man who knew things about his children," Augustine said peacefully. Frederick was examining a pebble he had picked up from the channel work with the dedicated attention of a man who was absolutely not listening to every word of this conversation. The channel was completed on the 5th day, and it worked. Not perfectly, nothing on a farm worked perfectly, but well enough that the pasture received sufficient water, and by the end of June the grass was holding and the cattle were not suffering. Georgia recorded it all in her ledger, the dates, the work, the result, evidence of productive use, evidence of a woman who knew her land. Frederick submitted the document he had written about the premature debt claim to the county land office by courier on the 4th of July, addressed to the judge who had set the terms of the settlement season. They received no immediate response, which Frederick said was expected. The judge would sit on it until settlement day. But it was in the record now, and that was what mattered. July was the most beautiful month. Georgia had forgotten this, the way the Wyoming summer peaked and blazed, the days long and gold and exuberant, the nights cool enough to sleep under a blanket. The garden was producing abundantly, more than she could use alone, and she began selling the surplus at the Laramie market on Saturdays, which added to her accounts and to the record of productivity. Her chickens were laying 10 eggs a day. The cattle were healthy, and she had begun to think about whether to add to the herd. She was also, in July, beginning to understand that she was in serious danger of being in love with Frederick Hale, and that this was not a small thing she could organize into a ledger and file away. It had accumulated slowly and then all at once, the way certain things did, like the way the creek had seemed fine, and then was clearly not fine, except in this case the realization was not alarming. It was just there, as present and substantial as the mountains. She noticed things about him that she had no practical reason to notice. The way he tilted his head when he was listening carefully, the way he was gentle with the horses and the cattle in the same deliberate, respectful way he was with her, the way he read in the evenings. He had 3 books in his small room in the barn, well-worn, clearly loved, and how he sometimes paused with a book open in his hands and stared at the space above it, thinking about something he never explained. She noticed the way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking. She had caught this several times now, the quality of his attention when it was unguarded, and it was nothing like the way men usually looked at women, which was often either dismissive or appetitive. He looked at her the way he looked at the land, with care and recognition and a kind of steadied wonder. She was not certain what to do with this information. She was very busy with a farm. It was the evening he asked her about her mother that something shifted between them in a way that could not be quite shifted back. They were on the porch, as they often were in the evenings, the July darkness warm and full of crickets and the smell of the turned earth from the garden. Georgia had been telling him about the market in Laramie, the regulars, the gossip, a woman who came every week to buy green beans with the dedicated fervor of someone who had made an important life decision about green beans. She had made him laugh, actually laugh, not just the corner of the mouth thing, but a full, open sound that surprised her with how much she wanted to hear it again. "My mother used to sell at a market," Georgia said, and the memory arrived without warning. "When I was small. In Kansas, before we came to Wyoming, she would sell jams and preserves. She had a yellow cloth she always spread on the table. She stopped. She died when I was 11. "I know," Frederick said quietly. "Your father told me he missed her every day." Georgia looked at the mountains in the dark. "He never said that in his letters either." "No, but the way he talked about this place, it was always about her too. She helped build it. She planted the first garden. He kept it the way she left it." Georgia was quiet for a long time. The crickets went on and the stars came out and the night was very large and soft. "I am not afraid of grief," she said. "But I am afraid of wasting what people leave behind." "That is why you came back," Frederick said. "Yes." She turned and looked at him, and there was something in the directness of her gaze that was different from her usual directness, more open, less defensive. "And you, what are you afraid of wasting?" He was quiet. The question sat between them in the warm dark, and he did not deflect it or redirect it. He considered it the way he considered everything, seriously and without pretense. "Time," he said. "I spent a long time doing things that were not quite right for me. Not wrong, but not right. I kept waiting for something that felt like the right place." He looked at her. "This is the first place that has felt like that." George's heart was doing something it had not been doing 3 months ago. "Are you talking about the land?" she asked. He held her gaze steadily. "I am talking about everything on it," he said. The crickets were very loud. Somewhere in the pasture, one of the cattle made a low, sleepy sound. George's hands were folded in her lap and she looked down at them for a moment and then back up. "Frederick," she said. "Yes. I think you should know that I have never been particularly good at this," she said. "At whatever this is, I am better with ledgers." "I am aware," he said. "I find it one of the most remarkable things about you," she stared at him, "that I am bad at it." "That you face it the same way you face everything else," he said, directly and without artifice. He turned on the step slightly toward her. "I am not going to pretend I came here just for Edmund's sake, Georgia. I came back because I hoped you would be here. When I heard about the claim and the ruling, I hoped you would come." The candor of this was so complete and unexpected that Georgia felt something in her chest unlock with almost physical sensation. She had been armored for so long, 3 years in Cheyenne building a life from scratch, 4 months here building it from scratch again. And the armor had gotten very good, and she had forgotten what it felt like when it was not necessary. "I am glad I came," she said. She reached out and covered his hand with hers on the step between them, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them spoke for a while. And the mountains were invisible in the dark, but present in the way that the most permanent things always were. And the land was breathing around them with all the life they had put into it. And Georgia thought that her father might have been right about the right kind of help finding her after all. After that, things were both simpler and more complicated in the particular way that being in love always managed. Simpler because the unnamed thing between them was named now, or at least acknowledged, and so there was less energy spent in the circling of it. More complicated because Georgia was a woman with a principle about not being distracted from what was important, and she was trying to run a farm in a season that would decide her future, and having Frederick Hale smile at her across the garden in the morning light was somewhat devastating to her concentration. He was careful with her in the way of a man who understood that she needed room to be herself, did not hover, did not assume, did not try to take over decisions that were hers to make. But there were small things. The way he made sure her coffee was ready when she came in from the early morning feeding. The way he stood close beside her when they were looking at something in the field together, not touching, just present, and she was aware of his warmth. The way once when she slipped in the mud by the creek and went down hard on one knee, he was beside her in an instant with his hand extended, and when she took it he pulled her up and checked her over with a look of concern so genuine and unguarded that she had to look away to keep from saying something that would have surprised both of them. "I am fine," she said. "I know you are," he said. "You are always fine." I still looked. She let herself lean against him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went clean off her knee, and he went back to what he had been doing, and they did not speak of it, but the warmth of it stayed with her all afternoon. August came with a heat that pressed down on everything like a hand. The garden needed constant water. The cattle sought the shade of the timber at midday. The secondary channel Frederick and Augustin had cut held up through the dry stretch, which was both a relief and a small triumph, proof that the preparation had been sound. Georgia recorded the water levels every 3 days in her ledger. Croft came twice in August, each time with different men, each time with the same pleasant, poisonous manner. He complimented the garden. He noted the channel work with a slight tightening around his eyes that told Georgia he had not expected it to work. He said nothing specific enough to be a threat, but the intent was always present, like a smell. On his second August visit, Frederick was working the fence line along the south pasture, visible from the road. Croft looked at him for a long time before turning back to Georgia. "You have put yourself in a complicated position," Croft said, not unkindly. "A woman alone trying to run a property this size. The land office is going to look very carefully at whether the productive use has been by your own effort or by the effort of a hired hand. The land office will find that both parties have worked this land, which is exactly how farms operate," Georgia said, "and they will find records of every hour of it." "Yes," Croft said, and something in his eyes sharpened briefly. "Your records, of course." He tipped his hat. "Settlement day is the 1st of October, Miss Slater. I look forward to it." After he was gone, Georgia went inside and sat very quietly for a moment. Then she opened her ledger to the most recent pages and looked at what she had. She had 4 months of meticulous documentation. She had a working garden in full production. She had a healthy cattle herd. She had a repaired barn, a functional well, a maintained fence line, a productive chicken coop, and income from the Saturday market. She had Frederick's legal challenge to the premature debt claim. She had the word of Augustin Reyes, who had known this land and this family for years. It would have to be enough. But something had been troubling her since Croft's comment about the productive use being attributed to Frederick's efforts rather than her own. She went back through her records and looked at how she had written them. She had been careful to note what each person had done, but the work had been so intertwined that the distinction was sometimes blurry on paper even when it had been clear in life. She was revising her documentation that evening when Frederick came in from the barn. He read her expression immediately. "What is it?" he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, then sat down across from her and pulled the ledger toward him. He read carefully. After several minutes he said, "You are right that some of these entries are ambiguous. We need to amend them." He looked up. "The channel work. You conceived the plan, directed the design, and made the key decisions about the routing. That needs to be explicit. You and Augustin did the heaviest digging. At your direction," he said firmly. "I need you to understand something. In the eyes of the land office, the relevant question is who exercises ownership and management of the land. That is you. Hiring workers to do physical tasks is what every property owner does. What matters is that you are the one making the decisions, keeping the accounts, directing the operation. Croft is going to argue that I could not have done it without you. He might try, but your records will show a woman who came onto this land on the 1st of April with a deed and a plan, and who has been running it methodically ever since." He looked at her steadily. "That is the truth, Georgia. Every decision about this land has been yours." "Not every one," she said. "The fence post on the east line, you told me about the stone. You had been working on it for 20 minutes, you would have found it. The legal challenge was your idea. You were the one who gathered the documents and understood their significance when I explained it. The submission was under your name." He leaned forward slightly. "Georgia, you have been running this land. I have been here helping you, the same as any farmhand would. The difference is that I happen to care very much about the outcome." She looked at him. The lamp was lit between them, and the evening was warm, and the day had been long, and she was tired in the specific deep way that was also satisfaction. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. He looked at her as if the answer was so obvious that the question was almost funny. "Because it is yours," he said. "And because you are the most determined, capable, infuriating, remarkable person I have met in my life, and watching you work for something you deserve is—" He stopped. "I want to say something to you, and I want to say it correctly." She waited. He was quiet for a moment with the careful, deliberate quality she had come to love about him. "I came here for the work and for Edmund's memory," he said. "I stayed for all of those reasons. But I also stayed because every morning when I woke up and knew you were going to come out of that house with a list of 14 things that needed doing and the absolute intention of doing all of them, I wanted to be there for it. I wanted to be part of it." He met her eyes. "I want to be part of what happens here after October, if you will have me." Georgia set down her pen. The lamp made small, warm shapes on the walls of the kitchen, and outside the window the summer night was full and fragrant, and the garden was dark with growth. And she thought of her father sitting in his chair and worrying quietly about her in letters he never wrote. And she thought of her mother's yellow cloth at the market stall. And she thought of all the ways that love was also a kind of land, something you cleared and planted and worked and watched grow. "I have been trying," she said carefully, "not to think about what happens after October until after October." "That is sensible," he said. "But I think I have been thinking about it anyway," she said, "in spite of myself." And she looked at him across the lamp and the ledger and all the documented evidence of a season of shared labor and said, "I do not want you to leave. I have not wanted you to leave for quite some time." He was still for a moment. Then he said, "I told you on the first morning that I was not leaving until it was settled." "You meant the land claim," she said. "I meant everything," he said quietly. She stood up from the table, and he stood up too, and she walked around it to where he was, and he did not move toward her but let her come to him, which was exactly right. She stood in front of him and looked up at his face in the lamplight and then put her hand against his chest over his heart. "We have 6 weeks until October," she said. "Let us get through them first." He covered her hand with his. "All right. And then," she said, "we can discuss what settled means." He smiled then, not the corner of the mouth thing but the whole of it, open and warm, and Georgia Slater thought it was one of the finest things she had ever seen. The last 6 weeks of the season were somehow the best and the most demanding. The garden needed to be harvested and put up preserving, drying, root cellaring for the winter documentation, as well as the practical need. The cattle were in their best condition, and Georgia had sold 2 steers at market at a price that solidified her accounts comfortably. The fence was in good repair from end to end. The barn had been fully rechinked against the coming cold. Augustine came for a last long visit in mid-September, walked the whole property with Georgia and Frederick, and said at the end of it, with the satisfaction of a fair witness, "This land has been worked." Georgia had written to a lawyer in Cheyenne about the premature filing argument in Frederick's document. The lawyer, a woman named Clara Dodd, who had been one of the first female attorneys admitted in the territory, and who had a reputation for taking on land cases of this kind, had written back with a 3-page letter that was detailed, precise, and deeply encouraging. She would appear at the settlement hearing if Georgia wished. Georgia wrote back immediately. She wished. Croft's channel diversion had reduced the creek flow but had not defeated the land. The garden had produced abundantly. There were eggs recorded, sales recorded, cattle recorded, repairs recorded, weather and water levels and fence work and every small labor of every day across a full season. Georgia's ledger was 48 pages of handwritten evidence. She was ready. Settlement day was October the 1st, at the county land office in Laramie. Georgia wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool and very plain, and her good boots, and she braided her hair and pinned it carefully. Frederick wore clean clothes and his good hat, and he had shaved, which Georgia noticed with a feeling she did not examine until later. They rode into Laramie together in the wagon, Augustine coming on horseback alongside them. The land office was a single-story building of rough-cut timber on Laramie's Main Street. There was a small courtroom at the back, and it was there that the hearing was held before Judge Avery Crane, a lean man of 60 with a reputation for reading documents with great care and suffering foolishness with very little patience. Harlan Croft was already there with his lawyer, a man from Denver who cost more per hour than Georgia made in a week. Clara Dodd was there too, sitting at the other table with her files arranged neatly and her expression composed and confident. The hearing took 4 hours. Georgia presented her ledger. It was admitted into evidence. Every entry was read into the record. The judge asked questions at several points about the channel work, about the market sales, about the cattle, and Georgia answered each one with the precision of a woman who had been recording exactly these details for 6 months. She answered clearly. She did not hedge or qualify. Clara Dodd presented the legal argument about the premature filing of the debt claim. Croft's Denver lawyer objected several times and was overruled twice. Judge Crane read the relevant clause of the debt agreement himself, aloud, twice. Croft took the stand and said that the debt was valid regardless of the filing date and that the contested occupancy was the material issue. His lawyer argued that the productive use of the land had been primarily performed by a hired laborer, not the claimant. He specifically named Frederick Hale. Frederick was called to testify. He stood and spoke without notes in a voice that was calm and precise and stated, clearly and specifically, that every material decision about the operation of the Slater homestead during the subject season had been made by Georgia Slater, and that his role had been the physical execution of her plans, the same as any farmhand hired to do labor on land they did not own. He named dates, names, specific decisions. He had, it became clear, been keeping his own records for exactly this purpose. He presented them. Augustine testified after him. He spoke slowly and with the weight of a man who had been in this territory for 8 years and knew what a woman running a farm looked like, and said that from his observation, Georgia Slater had run the Slater homestead with competence and full commitment for the entire season, and that the land had been in better condition at its end than at its beginning. The judge recessed for 40 minutes. Georgia sat in the courtroom and did not speak. Frederick sat beside her, and his shoulder was against hers, and she felt it like ballast. Augustine sat behind them with his hat in his hands. Judge Crane came back in, sat down, and read for 3 minutes from his notes without looking up. Then he set the papers down and looked at the room over the rim of his spectacles. "The premature filing argument is technically sound," he said. "However, this court is not going to rest its ruling on a technicality of 4 days when the underlying debt obligation is not disputed." He paused. "What this court is going to rule on is the clear and documented evidence presented today of productive occupancy and use of the subject property during the mandated period." Another pause, longer. "The Slater homestead, 80 acres in the Laramie foothills, has been operated during this period as a functioning agricultural property with documented income, maintained infrastructure, working livestock, and cultivated farmland. This court finds that Georgia Slater has met and exceeded the terms of the productive use requirement." He looked at Croft over the spectacles. "The contested claim of Harlan Croft is hereby dismissed. The deed to the Slater homestead is confirmed in the name of Georgia Slater, free of encumbrance, effective this date." He stamped the document. The sound of it was the most satisfying sound Georgia had ever heard. She sat very still for a moment. Then she pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed out slowly. Frederick's hand covered hers on the table. She turned hers over and held his. Croft left without a word. His Denver lawyer gathered the papers with the quiet efficiency of a man who was going to send a bill regardless. Clara Dodd shook George's hand with a warm, firm grip and said, "Well done, Miss Slater. Very well done indeed." Outside on the street, in the October sunlight that was thin and sharp and turned everything gold, Georgia stood with the confirmed deed in her hands and looked at it. The paper was ordinary enough rough white paper with official stamps and Judge Crane's handwriting. But what it meant was everything her father had built, and everything she had proven, and everything that was going to come next. She looked up. Frederick was watching her with an expression she had seen once before, in the lamplight of the kitchen when he had said everything, and she found that she had nothing she particularly wanted to say, and everything she wanted to say, and the two things were approximately the same. Augustine appeared from behind her and clapped Frederick on the shoulder with enough force to require balance, and said, "I will go get a drink before I ride back. You two can find your own way home." He walked off down the main street of Laramie with the serene expression of a man who had done his job. Georgia looked at Frederick. "I want to go home," she said. "Yes," he said. "Let us go home." They drove back in the wagon as the October afternoon burned its gold light across everything, the mountains turning amber and rose, the aspen on the ridgeline already turned to coins of yellow that shook in the slight wind. The land looked like the land always looked in October in Wyoming, like the world was saying something final and beautiful before it quieted down for winter. Georgia sat beside Frederick on the wagon seat, and she was aware of every inch of the distance between them. Halfway back, she reached over and put her hand through his arm and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he did not say anything, just shifted slightly to make it more comfortable, and they rode the rest of the way home like that, through all the gold and amber of the October afternoon. The homestead looked like itself when they came up the track to it, the house with its east-facing porch, the barn behind it, the pasture fence in good repair, the garden gone to its autumn brown, the mountains enormous at the back of everything. Georgia looked at it as she had on that first morning, trying to feel something. What she felt now was different. Not smaller than grief and fury, but layered over them, something warmer and more forward-facing. This was hers. This was home. They unhitched the horse and Frederick put the wagon away and Georgia went inside and built up the fire, because the October evenings were cold already and the house needed warmth. She put water on for coffee and stood at the window and watched the last light go off the mountains. Frederick came in without knocking, which was new, she noted, and hung his hat on the hook by the door and stood in the middle of the kitchen looking at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "You did it." "We did it," she said. He shook his head slowly. "Georgia." "You did it. I was the help." "You were essential," she said. "There is a difference between help and essential." He looked at her for a moment. "I want to ask you something." "Ask it." He came across the kitchen to where she was standing and stopped in front of her with the same patient, deliberate quality that was so specific to him. And she thought again, as she had thought many times, that she had never met a man who thought before he spoke with such genuine commitment. "I want to ask you if you will marry me," he said. "I want to ask you now tonight, so that you know that what I want has nothing to do with the land being settled and everything to do with you. The land being settled is only the beginning of what I want for us." He was looking at her directly in the way she had first noticed about him, neither looking away too quickly nor staring too hard, just looking. "I love you, Georgia. I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd week of April, when you repaired the barn roof alone before I woke up, and then complained that the nails were inferior." Georgia laughed, which was not how she had expected this moment to go, and then she covered her mouth and laughed again, and he was smiling with the full warmth of it, and the fire crackled in the hearth behind her, and the coffee water was beginning to steam. "The nails were inferior," she said when she could. "They were," he said. "You were right. She looked at him, his steady face and his warm eyes and his hands that had worked her land beside her for a season and written legal arguments for her in lamplight and driven fence posts and carried water and told her the truth when she needed it. "Yes," she said. "Frederick, yes." He stepped forward and she stepped toward him, and when he kissed her, it was the same as everything else about him, unhurried and certain and deeply, thoroughly sincere. And she put her hands against his chest and felt his arms come around her and thought that this was what it meant to be precisely where you were supposed to be. They were married in November at the Laramie Church, in a ceremony witnessed by Augustin Reyes and Clara Dodd, and a handful of neighbors who had heard about Georgia Slater and her season of land proving, and come to the wedding with the particular warmth of people who liked a story that ended as it should. The minister was a young man who was clearly moved by the occasion. Georgia wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself, because she was a seamstress before she was a farmer, and she saw no reason not to use both skills. Frederick wore a dark coat that Augustin had pressed for him without being asked. The look on Frederick's face when Georgia walked down the aisle was one she would carry for the rest of her life. The look of a man who had been patient for good things and had found them and knew exactly what he had. She said yes again, formally this time, in front of witnesses and God and the Laramie Mountains visible through the church window. And when it was done, and the minister pronounced them married, and Frederick kissed her again in front of everyone, there was a small, genuine cheer from the assembled witnesses that Georgia felt in her chest like warmth. They went home to the Slater homestead, which was now the Hale homestead, though Georgia kept her father's name in the deed alongside Frederick's, because the land was partly his legacy, and that was right. They went home to a place that was already theirs, already known, already carrying the particular intimacy of two people who had worked a thing together from the ground up. The first winter was cold and companionable and full of the small revelations of shared domestic life. The discovery of preferences and habits, the small negotiations of space and rhythm, the particular pleasure of waking up beside someone, and finding that the ordinary details of a shared morning were among the finest available experiences. Frederick made coffee that was too strong and Georgia made biscuits that Frederick declared the best he had ever tasted, which she suspected was not entirely objective, but appreciated nonetheless. They read in the evenings by the fire, books from the small collection he had brought from the barn and others purchased on trips to Laramie. They talked and were silent in equal measure, and both were good. Frederick's brother, Thomas, came from Colorado in February to see the place and meet Georgia. He was a younger version of Frederick's same height, lighter coloring, easier laugh, and he looked at the two of them together for approximately 1 hour before taking Georgia aside and saying, with great sincerity, "He has been looking for this his whole life. I just want you to know that." She told him that she had been looking for it too and simply had not known the shape of it until she found it, and Thomas Hale shook her hand and smiled and seemed satisfied. Spring came again, and with it the second season on the land, which was different from the first in the way that all second seasons are different. The urgency of proving was gone, replaced by the deeper pleasure of building. They added to the cattle herd, bringing it to 12 head. They expanded the garden to twice its previous size, and Georgia began preserving in earnest for winter stores and for sale. Frederick built a smokehouse in the yard, which had been on Edmund Slater's list of intended improvements for years, using stone and timber from the property. They hired a young man from town for the summer months, a 16-year-old named Percy who worked hard and was quietly in awe of Georgia's efficiency, which she found amusing. Augustin came bi-weekly as always, and Clara Dodd came once from Cheyenne to see the place she had helped save, and she stood in the kitchen and looked around at the warmth and order of it and said to Georgia, "This is a fine thing," and Georgia said, "Yes, it is." It was in the summer of the second year that Georgia told Frederick she was expecting their first child. They were in the garden, late afternoon, the light long and yellow across the rows of beans and squash. She had been thinking about how to say it for a week and had finally decided that the best way was directly, because that was how she said everything. "I am going to have a baby," she said, looking at the bean plants. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Frederick set down his tools and turned to look at her, and his expression was the open, unguarded one that she had come to know as his real face beneath all the quiet patience, the face that came out when something moved him past his usual careful composure. "Georgia," he said. "In the winter, I think," she said. "January, perhaps." He crossed the garden row and cupped her face in his hands and looked at her the way he looked at things he valued beyond naming. "Are you well? Are you—" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am always perfectly well." "I know," he said, "but I still ask." And then he kissed her right there in the garden with the bean plants around their knees and the mountains watching, and she laughed against his mouth and held on to him with both hands. Their son was born in January of 1876, which meant he was a winter child, and entered the world during a snowfall so heavy that Frederick had to clear the porch 4 times before the doctor arrived. They named him Edmund for her father, and the name suited the baby, who was from the first days a serious and watchful presence, dark-haired like his father, with George's direct gaze. Frederick held his son for the first time on the evening after Edmund's birth, sitting in the chair by the fire with the baby in his arms and Georgia in the bed behind him resting, and his expression was one she had never seen on any face before, a kind of complete and stricken joy, too large for any normal expression to hold. "He is so small," Frederick said. "He will not stay that way," Georgia said. Frederick looked at the baby and then at her with the look she had first recognized in the kitchen months before settlement day, the one that said everything. "Thank you," he said. "We made him together," she said. "I know," he said. "Thank you anyway." Augustine came to see the baby and was visibly affected, sitting in the kitchen with Edmund held very carefully in both hands, and talking to him in a mix of English and Spanish, as though the baby was a person of great importance who simply needed to be briefed on the situation. Georgia watched this and thought of how loneliness was a country some people lived in for years, and how it was possible to leave it, if the right company came. Edmund grew steadily through that first year into a boy who liked to be outside, who followed his father around the property with concentrated attention from the time he could walk, and who adored Georgia with a loud, physical fervor that she found equally overwhelming and wonderful. He sat in her lap while she kept the accounts and put his small finger on the numbers as she wrote them, looking up at her face to check if he was doing it right. In 1878, a daughter came. They named her Marguerite, after Georgia's mother. She had red hair that neither of them could account for, and a personality that was entirely her own from the first week, loud, opinionated, and absolutely certain of her preferences. Frederick laughed at her frequently and with great joy. Edmund regarded his sister with the wary respect of a boy who sensed he was dealing with a superior force. Harlan Croft, it should be said, did not disappear from the territory. He continued to acquire land by various means, not all of them clean. But in 1877, one of his earlier manufactured debt claims caught up with him in the form of a lawsuit filed by the homesteader family Frederick had testified for, and Clara Dodd came out of Cheyenne to represent the plaintiffs. The resulting judgment cost Croft a significant portion of what he had accumulated, and he became, in subsequent years, a smaller and quieter presence in the county. He never came back to the Slater, now Hale homestead. The land itself grew with them. By 1879, they had 20 cattle, a full smokehouse, a root cellar that could hold a winter's provisions, a chicken flock of 23, and a kitchen garden that Georgia had expanded twice. The barn was rebuilt with better timber in the spring of that year, a project that took 6 weeks and involved every neighbor in a 3-mile radius coming to help at one point or another. Because that was what communities in frontier territories did, they showed up. Frederick and Georgia fed them all, and at the end of the last working day, they sat on the finished barn floor in the early evening and drank from a single bottle of good whiskey that Augustin had brought, and the mountains stood at the western edge of the sky, and the new barn smelled of fresh timber and promise. Edmund, who was 3, fell asleep against his father's side. Marguerite was a year old and was being held by Augustin with the careful devotion he applied to everything, and she was reaching for his mustache with both hands. Georgia sat beside Frederick in the straw on the barn floor and leaned against his shoulder. The whiskey was warm going down, and the evening air coming through the open barn door was the autumn kind, cool and clear and smelling of the timber and the turned earth. "Do you remember," she said, "the morning I came back?" "I remember everything about it," he said. "I was so angry to find you there," she said. "I know," he said. He was smiling at the mountains through the barn door. "I did not trust you." "You should not have," he said. "We were strangers." "How long did it take you to trust me?" she asked. He thought about it with the characteristic care. "By the end of the first week," he said. "You told the truth about what you could do and what you could not do, and you did not complain when it was hard. That was enough for me." Georgia looked at Edmund sleeping against his father and at Marguerite batting at Augustin's face with absolute commitment, and at the mountains through the door, and at the new timber walls around her, and at the man beside her who had come to her land before she had and stayed because something in him had recognized something in her and had not left until it was settled, until everything was settled, the land and the life and the long, complete, loving work of it. "It is a good life," she said. "It is the best life," Frederick said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the mountains were there as they had always been, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to human small matters, and yet somehow also present for them all the same, the way that great and permanent things were present for everything that happened in their view. Edmund slept. Marguerite laughed at something Augustin said. The new barn held its good smell of possibility. The land was hers. The life was theirs. And the season that had begun with a deed and a standoff on a porch had become, over the years, something so rich and true that Georgia Hale now, though she kept both names because they were both who she was, sometimes caught herself standing in the garden in the morning light, and being quietly, overwhelmingly grateful for the morning Frederick Hale had been leaning against her porch post when she rode up. The morning she had told him it was private property, and he had agreed and stayed anyway. The morning everything had started. And now, years on, with the mountains unchanged and the land thriving and the children growing and the man she loved working somewhere on the property she could hear if she listened, she thought that her father had been exactly right. The right kind of help had found her, and it had never left.